I wrote a note to myself, so I would have found it.
So are we ready? Michael might be, where is it?
Sorry.
Yeah, maybe been in like,
I'm sending the new
oh, okay.
presentation to
Okay,
Michael.
we can
I'll
wait a
bring it
minute
up
or so.
in a second.
All right.
Sorry.
Is he still sick?
Okay. Good afternoon, everyone. I call the Charlottesville September 3rd, 2024 City Council meeting to order. Ms. Thomas, will you please call the roll?
Councilor Oshrin?
Here.
Councilor Payne?
Here?
Vice Mayor Pinkston?
Here.
Councilor Snook?
Here.
Mayor Wade?
Here. Is there a motion to approve or amend the agenda?
I move for approval of the agenda.
Second.
Okay, motion passes. Can we vote? The meeting will be divided into 3 separate sections. This is the first one where we will hear and discuss presentations that don't require a council vote, and then we'll go into closed session, and then we'll come back at 6:30 for a regular business meeting. And the first report is UVA student research on the memory project. Ms. Smith, thank you so much. I think we,
Is it loaded?
David should be bringing it up
okay.
momentarily.
All right, okay. I'll just start with a few remarks. Council, thank you for having me. I'm Jelaine Schmidt, Professor of Religious Studies at the University of Virginia, and until June, the director of the Memory Project at the UVA Karsh Institute of Democracy. Wish to thank council and also the public for their patience as we compiled this research, and also our research team at the Memory Project. For the past 3 years, the Memory Project's research team, comprised of doctoral students in history, have been working at the Albemarle County Courthouse and the archives, uncovering records that pertain to the sale of enslaved people. The timelines for this, here we go. Great. Yeah, second slide, thank you. You can see that, okay. So the process of the Blue Ribbon Commission on Race Memorials and Public Spaces began in 2016 at your direction. I see that, of course, there's been a lot of turnover since then. But there was a 6-month process during 2016 in which the question of public memory with respect to race were considered in a series of meetings. Next slide, please. Accounts of the historical record emerged, particularly about sales of enslaved people in our Court Square area, which for a century or so earlier in our town's history was the centerpiece of our community. Of note was the 1829 sale of enslaved people from Thomas Jefferson's estate, and noted here even in subsequent decades, including in the 20th century, was record of the number of slaves that were sold there, with some very unflattering comparisons between humans and horses, I should say. Next slide, please. At the conclusion of the 6-month period, the Blue Ribbon Commission made its final report to City Council, to your predecessors. There was general consensus among the public, notwithstanding the debate about statues, which attracted the most attention, but there was consensus that there should be more memorializing and markers pertaining to sales of enslaved people in Court Square. What was of note was that the majority of the local population for most of the 19th century here was enslaved, and the Blue Ribbon Commission noted to your predecessors that this was something that was a priority. Next slide, please. With that, and I'll skip playing an excerpt, but we actually have a recorded interview with a formerly enslaved person from Charlottesville, Mr. Fountain Hughes, who recounts, among these other accounts that we've found, the sales of enslaved people at Court Square. Next slide, please. Yeah, thank you. In subsequent years, from 2019 forward, there have been numerous public vigils that have been held by descendants at these sites around Court Square, in which priority has been given to actually saying their names. And of course, some of these names have been uncovered by my team's research, which I've entered into the record. It's about a 200-page report. And these here are descendants that are gathered that are reading firsthand accounts from enslaved folks that were sold there or were about to be sold at Court Square. Next slide, please. There's been an insistence on the part of the community with just kind of volunteer flowers appearing and other ad hoc observances that have occurred. I understand that there is a local grocery store which weekly donates flowers, which are then placed there in a sort of unofficial marking of the space. And it seems that it's kind of an insistence by the public to have better public history. Next slide, please. Your predecessors on council referred the case of these sales of enslaved people to the Historic Resources Committee of the city in order to conduct more research on this. And so the HRC, of which I'm an appointed member, began conducting community engagement with descendants of enslaved communities here, and had a series of these during the pandemic, during the quarantine even, so we had to move to Zoom during that year. And also held other events such as this one at the public library to consider the history of enslaved people and what other communities are doing to memorialize this. Next slide, please. And so then as I took over the leadership of the Memory Project at UVA in 2021, I took this charge from the Historic Resources Committee. I wear two hats, both for the city with the Historic Resources Committee, as well as at UVA in my capacity as a researcher there and as leadership of a research team. And so my team took up doing this research at the courthouse, and this is where we started having meetings and presenting the works in progress. That's okay. Go ahead and progress to the next slide. We began having public events, presenting this to, first of all, to descendants along the way, to the Central Virginia Historical Resources, to the Albemarle Charlottesville Historical Society, various fora at UVA, and of course the Historic Resources Committee of the city as well. So I've presented to you here the conclusion of the report. And I, thank the public and thank council for their interest in this. And I know that it's a research project. We did this because in that community engagement process with descendants said what was important was to have names and stories. They wanted to know, who their ancestors are. So, and it has broader public import in terms of truth-telling in our community, which is something that was the community indicated was a priority during the Blue Ribbon Commission and in subsequent years. So, I want to advance to the next slide. And here is one of our periodic presentations of the research in the courthouse itself with descendants gathered around with the research team. So presenting this now as it's an opportune time. We have going on right now, we have the parks renovation going on, as well as the courthouse square renovations that are going on. So this is an opportune moment, as we're deciding what to do in our public spaces to consider memorializing sales of enslaved people in Court Square. Why Court Square? Because it's our seat of justice, and it was, as my team found out and is presented in the research you can read, the court was intimately involved in adjudicating these sales and recording the deeds and indeed property taxes, because humans were counted as property. And so this is our seat of justice, and it's something that it's a place that we are reconsidering how to mark the public landscape. So it seems that this is an opportunity, and I hope that the folks that are involved with Parks Department and as well as the consultants and the people that are involved with the Court Square renovations will take into consideration this. One of the things that I've often pointed out is that we have presently more physical markers of 19th century horses, and I'm pointing to, of course, the fountain. I don't know if you've noticed the big fountain with the base there. It's about 7 foot tall and 3.5 feet wide. We have more markers about 19th century horses, plaque there with over 100 words, than we do for 19th century humans who are being sold there. So it seemed this would be an opportunity in speaking with descendants about, and also with members of the public during the Blue Ribbon Commission process about what was wanted. People articulated that they wanted something that broke the physical plane, that wasn't just a plaque underfoot or even just a plaque that was raised, but something that was of human scale, that represented the humanity of folks whose stories had otherwise been overlooked. So I'll end there, and just if you have any questions, I'd be happy to have them.
Thank you so much. Go ahead.
Yeah, really appreciate this. Where would we actually find the report? Is it online?
It should have been sent to you. It was sent.
There was a couple of pages in the packet. Was that the report?
There's a summary.
Okay. Oh, okay. The 200 page.
Yeah, I haven't seen that.
Okay. This is the full report. Is this?
Okay. Is there a link to that or something?
What you sent to me was the.
Yeah, last week, so it may have been an error, but I'll forward it all out to you.
I can also add it online to the council agenda page as an attachment, and you can see it separately.
That'd be great.
Cool. Yeah, I'd be very interested in that. And how does this work? I met with Dr. Douglas, Andrea Douglas, on Thursday maybe last week with her Swords in the Plowshares effort. Is that integrated or connected to this at all, or in dialogue?
It's all related in the
Sure.
sense that our community has been saying that we want to prioritize a more fulsome rendering, I guess, of our history, and also a more democratic representation in public spaces, and that includes the physical objects that are there. Of course, we went through a long process of removing some that did not comport, with our professed values about multiracial democracy. So this is not the same project. It is an additional one,
Right.
but it is something that is swords into plowshares and a possible memorial to to the sales of enslaved people. Are considerations for the public landscape in terms of truth telling that have both met with an opportune moment.
So the park master plan that's happening, hopefully we'll find some way to incorporate some of this. I'm not sure what that would look like. I'm just sort
Right.
of,
My understanding is that the
spitballing.
consultant's report is due to council by the end of September. Is that correct?
For the parks master plan, I know
For
it's.
the consultants, or no?
No, by the end of the year, that's kind of what I'm, beginning of the year. Yeah.
All right, so
Mhm.
there's still time.
Yeah.
Then, which is good because I was at an event, a public event at the Jefferson School last week, and there were some members of the audience. It was an event for about the Fifeville neighborhood, and some members of the audience expressed surprise that there was a park process going on. They were unaware, So anyway, it's tricky to kind of catch, with the public engagement to get the folks, involved to get that kind of feedback. But anyway, there is a public out there that is interested in this and is looking on to see what we do, and I hope that the consultants will take this into account.
if I could ask you, Dr. Schmidt, the students that you had working on this, what was it like for them?
Well, they were doctoral students in history, and so for
Okay.
them, this was a significant part of their training as
Okay.
scholars. To be delving into, what can be very arcane, public records, and they're of course written in cursive, in that 19th century cursive, and include words that are unfamiliar. This 200-page report even includes a glossary at the back because some of the terms are just so unfamiliar,
Yeah.
to us. But these were, public records. That are there, and yeah, they reported that some of them have since went on. There were some folks that were there for a master's. One has gone on to a doctoral program at Johns Hopkins, another to Harvard. Others are completing their work here. So this was a significant part of their training.
Very interesting.
Lloyd, did you have anything to add?
No, not really.
Michael?
Yeah, I guess the big question for me is around implementation of what this all may mean. As I understand it, and correct me if I'm wrong, the parks planning process will more likely kind of come to us with recommendations that might identify within the parks, like this would be a place for future public art, but not so much getting involved with designing or deciding what that might be. So I'm just curious what implementing and deciding what these new memorials would actually be or what that process would entail, because I just want to ensure it's not, it doesn't fall by the wayside,
Right, and which is a good concern. There were some members of the public that were, a bit nervous when it seemed that the time was fallow for so long, but actually it was that this team was, trying to do such an amount of research in 3 years and the pandemic, but we're on it, and I want to, assure people. But in terms of going forward, I don't know, what kind of process the consultants are going to recommend, for the parks, but I imagine, kind of more public engagement, and, I know that that's something that the Swords into Plowshares project has also recommended, and that we did here on this project. So what it looks like, I'm not sure. I mean, you'll see in the referring this to the agenda on the calendar item that there's not a budget allocation that is listed. I assume that can come later, but we wanted to put this steps to kind of lay the groundwork for further discussion going forward. So I hope that council will, as we gather more information from the process about the parks and about the courts renovation, we'll consider this as part of a package for looking at public art. And I can just really mention that this community was unusual for a southern town of its size in the 20th century for having such monumental scale commissioned original artwork. I'm referring to the Confederate monuments minus the soldier one, which was a mass-produced thing. But, but the other, then the two, Lewis and Clark and George Rogers Clark, very unusual. And indeed, as the tourism industry ramped up here in the early 20th century with the building of the hotel, with the purchase of Monticello and more people coming in, Charlottesville was on the map as a place, a sophisticated place that appreciated public art, you know. We have now, you know, by the accounts of some folks, you know, kind of denuded the landscape of this because we've decided this does not fit, the types of representations that were there don't fit with our values now. But we have another chance to get on the map again, you know, to really think big about ourselves. It's already starting with the Memorial to Enslaved Laborers over there at UVA, which has won accolades, you know, by top art and architecture and landscape organizations. And it'd be nice to have a complement to that in the town, to put ourselves on the map again for believing in public art.
Right. Because, yeah, I think, you know, my concern, and it sounds like what you've said, is it was very clear, you know, the results of these processes where people didn't just want, you know, parks that look like any park or place in the country where you have maybe, you know, a small plaque that's standing up this time, but you have pieces of public art that create identifiable places that people can't miss and engage with and are telling a true narrative. And I just, in terms of our internal processes, I want to make sure that we don't, because this is a process that has taken so much time and effort and has gone through changes in city council, city manager leadership, that the initial goals aren't lost and we kind of just revert back to
Right.
maybe the path of least resistance in terms of what is put in these places after the process.
Well, and that's part of what this report is back to, kind of, you know. It's the, you know, the memory, you know, as it were, and reporting back to the original body. I mean, it was your predecessors, you know, who kind of lobbed the ball into our court, as it were, the Historic Resources Committee. So yeah, but there is a public out there that's looking at this, and I'm confident that they will keep letting you know, that this is a priority, and hope that we can regain our former stature as a community that appreciates public art.
Definitely, yeah, and I agree. I think the timing is just critical for Court Square Park, Market Square Park,
Tonsil
all
in
these,
Washington as well.
right?
Yeah.
And thinking about how all these places fit together as part of, you know, a narrative in public spaces in our community. So, thank you for the report and all the work. I know it's not easy or quick, particularly when you're grounding engagement with descendants and their feedback as the top priority.
Absolutely.
That's not something that can happen easily or overnight or as fast as maybe some people would like.
Yeah, democracy takes time.
Natalie, do you have anything?
Thank you for echoing that sentiment. Thank you for all of the work that went into this for you and all of your research partners and students. And it's looking through old things is difficult, especially if there is that emotional connection. And I also don't want this to fall by the wayside, to use your words there for what happens next. How in contact are you all with the Parks Department directly, or is this something that has to go through us? That's maybe a more procedural question for our Parks team and city, but.
I guess give me more context as to what you're looking for. I'm going to
Yeah.
say something, but I want you all to finish.
Okay, so I guess if and when there is a presentation where the Parks Department says, here are some spaces that would be good for public art, what's the engagement process for picking what goes where? How involved are we in that? Is it something we just, like, you all talk to directly, or are we a middle group for that conversation?
I'll try to answer that question.
Thanks, Marianne.
Again, as I mentioned in the beginning when we started the process, there are a lot of interest groups, which is great. And we've been working with Dr. Douglas in the beginning. The more information we can get, what we do is we'll take it to our consultant to add it into a master plan. So when they do reviews, they can review it through a lens that of different interest groups. And then a report will then be generated and come to council January or February to make those decisions.
Mm-hmm. Right. And hopefully that there's now just hot off the presses a publication of a final report for the Swords into Plowshares project as well. So we've got data, about public art or the, potential for it, that can definitely be shared with the consultants so that they can take that into consideration.
Great, thank you.
So, I just had a couple of comments. From what I heard, you said that the people wanted like names and stories with that, and it's funny that you mention that because this last Friday I met with some residents of Rose Hill and Cultivate Charlottesville. We were talking about putting a garden in there, and some of the elders in Rose Hill, these are older African Americans, they talked about the history and what that is going to look like. So I think this is and I've heard that before, that it's a desire of stories needing and want to be told as we get many new residents here, and even a new person, because I've been here 30-some years, but I'm still from another place, and I didn't know the history. This meeting, they're talking about the barn at Washington Park and how the history of the barn, and I've been here for a long time. I hadn't heard, and I just was enthralled to hear all about the barn and things that took there. I say that to say is that it's important to tell these stories, and to hear and to get it from the people that not many of this had firsthand experience, but it's people that can speak to it. And my last question is, I see we just got the full study, but did it offer some recommendations on what those names and stories would look like as part of that 200-page?
There is a kind of a specific section in there. I believe it's in this page 157 and following. There are some very kind of more fleshed out stories that are there. And we have some others too, like such as that of Fountain Hughes or Mrs. Maria Stewart and others, Mrs. Rebecca McGinnis. We have several like that. And I can imagine, as you know, I lead these tours, civil rights tours during the summer, and we go to lots of sites of memory. And there's some wonderful examples of how to use individual stories, which are much more tactile than just stats and figures and data, which can be very dehumanizing in a whole nother way, but having stories like that of local figures, such as Fountain Hughes, such as Maria Perkins, I guess her name is, and others, really brings it home, I think. And so, as the descendant said, we want stories. Stories are humanizing, stories are relatable. And as we've seen, we can have an intersection of stories with public art. We've seen what that can look like in many different places, certainly down in Montgomery, Alabama, but even here at the University of Virginia.
Thank you. Sam, I know you want to.
Yeah, so what I'll offer is just a little more procedural context, I guess, just to kind of frame out for the public's benefit as well, but also just for council to appreciate. The consultants that have been retained for the master planning process will not design what goes in our parks. That's not their job. They will not design markers. They will not design these various things. What we've asked them to do specifically with 4 parks within our network, our system, is to spend extra time looking at them through conversation with the public. So that's Tonsler, Washington, Court Square, and Market Street. The intention is that there could be individualized moments offered to the public to speak more in depth as to what we like here or what do we not want to be considered here, so that these individual parks retain the integrity, the character that we want. Speaking of Market Street Park specifically, that park brought this community to its knees. So we're going to be very careful about what goes back into that park, obviously. And it's important for us to not lose sight of that. And I think part of what we planned in the planning process was to make sure that we look for what are the various thoughts, the ideas that we could hear from anybody in the community that was willing to engage. And we're not done. It hasn't stopped. We'll continue to do that. What I would say is this work done by this student group and any other materials that we can get our hands on all gets provided to the consultants, because that's part of their scan. That's part of what they've heard from this community overall. And what we can anticipate is that they're going to say, Market Street Park, you're going to be very careful at what you choose to do there. You're going to be very intentional about what you think about doing there. You might want to consider doing this, this, and this, but that's not telling us what to do. It's just making an observation based on the feedback that they received. When it comes to how we place public art across this community, one thing that we have discovered is we don't have a policy. Mr. Freeze is already working on that effort right now because I told him I wanted one to make sure that we have one in place so that we can at least provide parameters to anyone that would like us to consider any piece that might go into a park. And the goal is really to be more helpful to those groups so that they know what things we're going to be looking for in doing that work. But the designing of structures, monuments, and all that is not going to be for the consultant to do. You might choose to hire a specific consultant to do something like that. That would be in your purview. You might engage your Historic Resources Committee to task them with speaking about things that you might want to be considered and bring those recommendations back. His job is to manage these spaces. So what we do inside those spaces then becomes his responsibility. So just want to make sure that we're separating and understanding where the decision-making process lies. The consultants will not dictate what goes in any one of these parks at all. They're only going to set more of a frame. You have this much space. These trees are historic and you're not going to take them down, so it's going to limit choices. You might want to do something with your sidewalks or what have you. That's to what degree it'll go, and then it'll give a community context as to what was expressed, as to how you might want to program that space.
Great, thanks.
Yeah.
That's helpful.
But you will be involved in all the decisions down the road, I can assure you that.
Yeah, Mr. Anthony, have you actually heard anything directly from Dr. Douglas with the Swords into Plowshares? I met with her last Tuesday, and they're trying to summarize and finalize their, I guess, their report or feedback or recommendations, and it sounds like it wasn't going to be quite done by the time you had asked for that input to be submitted. Have you heard from her about that, or?
I have been in contact with the doctor, and I have not received the report yet.
Okay.
But
I
again,
think it's coming soon.
Yes.
So I know that may go past the deadline, but I hope you all will still
Oh, absolutely.
incorporate. Yeah.
absolutely, anything that we can get, we'll send off to our consultant
Yeah.
to add to our.
It was a good
input.
conversation with her, and I don't know if you've had a chance to talk with her, Sam.
Not
or
recently.
But
Yeah.
I think you.
I think
We've
she-
talked about it, but not recently.
Yeah, she reached out to me as well, and we had a little mini wave of emails about to make sure that it's included, and so it was never any notion from us that it wouldn't be. You can touch base with her and make sure that. So.
Yeah. No, and that's helpful in terms of process, and just would second what the mayor said earlier in terms of, I think it'll just be so important to have it rooted in local history, local stories, local people, and even if it's unintentional, a process that kind of sanitizes it into, again, something that could be any city in the country in terms of, what is there in those spaces. But
Okay. Any other questions? Your students, did they get an A? Can you tell us that?
This was not a graded
Okay.
project, but the fact that they finished their doctorates, I think
Okay.
speaks for itself.
Thank you. Thank you so much,
Thank you.
and please, this is great information, so thank you. The next item that we have is a report on the downtown downtown mall tree management plan.
That's a mouthful.
Yeah,
Prime time.
yeah.
Downtown.
So I'd like to introduce Paul. He will be giving the presentation. Just to kind of put it all in context, when we got the consultant on board, we presented our timeline. And today is discussing the hard work that Parks and Rec and the consultant's been doing, and kind of giving you the end results of the Downtown Mall tree study. Paul?
All right. Thank you very much. Hello, members of council, Mr. Mayor. Appreciate being here today. As we'll go over the tree management plan for the downtown mall and look at, just from an agenda, we're going to keep this to 20 minutes. I'm going to go very quickly over a lot of items. Schedule, project scope, some historical context of the downtown mall, as well as just phase one and later phase recommendations. So our team, Wolf Josie Landscape Architects, Paul Josie and Peter Russell, the project manager, we worked really a lot of tree plans at the University of Virginia, University of North Carolina, Duke, a few other of those places, then also Smithsonian. So we've done a lot of tree and soil work around the Mid-Atlantic and Southeast. And we also had Keith Pitchford from 40 years experience in arboriculture and tree care, as well as lining grade for civil engineering and Downey and Scott. We worked with the city management team with Rian and Stephen and Rob Mathis and looking at with them, as well as two different committees, that one based of city staff as well, and one with community advisory committees. And so what those were consisted of is members of the various city group, staff groups from Public Works, Parks and Rec, Fire Department, et cetera, and also from more of an advisory committee with members of council and University of Virginia Architecture School, Historic Resources, BAR, and other groups. And this is the timeline of the project, where you can see we met with you in January of this year, and this is almost a year's worth of work being consolidated today. But we had a number of meetings with those staff groups as well as those community advisory groups throughout the process, and just sort of bringing them along as we went through these different, from data gathering to site analysis to the recommendations to this today, which is our sort of final recommendations for this project in the book. So you've seen, some of you have seen this image before. This is of the extent of the mall development over time. So 1976 was the original mall work that was completed by Lawrence Halpern and Associates. 1980 was the phase two. Then came the Omni, and then you had other sort of smaller projects throughout, including the 2009 rebricking of the entire downtown mall, and then in most recently the city at the Code Building. So we looked at all these areas, and then we wanted to look at really the history of this again. This is really critical to see what was the design intent of the mall. And the reason is that the mall is actually a pretty incredible design asset to the city of Charlottesville. It's designed by Lawrence Halpern's office, who really specialized in community engagement during the 1960s and 70s, and had a large-scale community engagement process in this, as well as thinking about the design. And so he's worked all over the country. And this is one of the only, it's on the Downtown Register of National Places, obviously the Downtown Mall, but he also, it's his only place still existing in Virginia. It is really a great asset to the city and to the state. There of the 132 malls that were built in the 50s to the 70s, only 43 exist, and Charlottesville's is the longest at 8 blocks long, and really a notable downtown mall. And there's a few reasons for this, just from a design standpoint. There was a layout of the bosques that we'll look at, and how the tree bosques or groves were placed, the vegetation itself and how they were in those groups of trees, the paving, how it differentiated with these longer bricks that was different than the vertical bricks of the architecture, the fountains that were throughout the mall design, and then the small scale, human scale furnishing. So this is just a diagram that shows how the groves are laid out in groups of 3, 5, 7, generally along the mall. And these are placed not in a single straight line. I think this is really one of the successes of the downtown mall, that the groves sort of shifted back and forth, and it made people have to bump into each other. If you think about designing it as a dance routine, that you don't have a two-way street. You really are bumping into each other in a sort of a constantly changing, evolving block at each block. Also, what was, you can see in this diagram here as we get into the recommendations, that dashed line where you're already starting to see these missing trees in the downtown mall. This is kind of showing the health of the current trees. And So we look at these recommendations. The first one is just what are the phase 1 trees that need replacement that are really in poor shape or already missing. We're looking at the grates at the base of the trees. We'll also look at the side streets. We'll also look at some of the fencing and how you view the trees of the cafe spaces, and then tree maintenance and BMP recommendations. So starting this off, this is just looking at the overall. You can see from the top left the Omni Hotel, and then working down to the next diagram all the way to Ting Pavilion, and you can see Central Place in the bottom left of your screen there, where that little blue square is, so just orienting you. And we started to look at these trees, again, over about 70% of the trees are willow oaks. Those are the trees, a predominant tree in the center of the downtown mall, as well as some other trees, species throughout. And when we started to look at the health of the trees, over 60% of the trees are in good to excellent health, and that is okay. Those trees are great, but when you start to think about what about the other 40% of those trees, we can see that 12%, 15 trees have already been removed. There's another 6.5% that are proposed to be removed as a result of this report. And there's a number of trees that are in fair to poor shape. And those trees will decline faster than the good to great trees. And so what we'll start to see, again, this is the current trees at 88% of our canopy, but then we start to see proposed removals today. Really, it's 82%, so now we're at 1/5 of our canopy, roughly. And then if you look out 5 to 10 years, we're projecting that you're looking at up to 25% of your trees being removed due to health. And then when you look at 10 to 15 years out, if nothing happens, we're approaching 45% of our canopy being lost. And so there's a lot more pink X's on this diagram here. If we do nothing for the downtown mall trees, they're at their high water mark now, and they are in decline. So if nothing is done, this is what we're trying to prevent from happening with this report and recommendations. Phase 1 is looking at just replacements. There's 2 areas that are really clear poor health trees. There's a 7-tree bosque. That's too many trees. They just all compete with each other. That is in front of the Jefferson Theater. Those trees are in very poor shape. There's also at Central Place, most of those trees are already dead. And those were actually replaced in 2009 as another pass, and it turns out maple is a terrible tree for that location. So this is a kind of a low-hanging fruit. This area really has a look, not only is there a derelict, unfinished hotel, but like it has a pass-through space quality to it, where you want to get through it as fast as possible. There's no shade, there's no refuge. It is a forgotten space on the downtown mall, and it is at the center of the mall, and where it's really meant to be the heart of it. So with no shade and no trees, it really doesn't have a destination. So this is kind of an easy phase 1 of looking at these areas. You already have, the bank is moving out, or has moved out, and then you have, a derelict hotel, and you have other businesses that have moved out in this area because of lack and neglect. And so this is a great phase 1 to start with new trees. The reason we don't replace one tree at a time is because it's critical to grow trees together all at once. They will grow up, you'll see clearly underneath those canopies, and they'll have the experience of a single bosque. But the canopies are high enough that you'll be able to see clearly from a safety standpoint. If you grow those trees one at a time, they struggle to grow in their own shade. So the trees will just stunted, and then they'll actually block views, those new trees, and they won't grow over time. So it's critical that we don't just take out one tree and put a new one in, because it really just won't grow. There's 2 approaches from a cost standpoint on how you can replace these trees. One is just remove the grate. You actually blow out the soil, and you cut out as much of that tree and stump and base as possible, crane that out, put in new soil, new grates, and new trees. This process is relatively quick. You keep the existing soils, which are somewhat compacted underneath those existing slab. And when I say compacted, trees really thrive in a forest-like condition with soils that are uncompacted. As you compact them, there's less air space for roots to grow into, as well as water and air to exchange and trees to grow. So trees live shorter lives when they grow in compacted soil. So this replicates the current condition here. Our trees are now at approaching 50 years old, and they are starting to decline. These trees could live a lot longer if you had better soils in those. So this brings us to our next approach, which would be an entire block replacement of soils. where you take each grove out and you replace the entire volume of soil, and you have a suspended slab that keeps an uncompacted soil beneath for these trees to have a much longer lifespan in them. So healthier trees over the long term, more expensive obviously as well.
What would, like, estimation of the lifespans be between those two different approaches?
I think you're 50 to 60 year trees, and then you're looking at, 90 plus, it really depends on the tree species, but yeah, you can get a lot more life out of them. The next point here is the paver grates. You can see the design, the original design was that there was a structural grate hidden underneath the paving and then bricks right up to the tree. So as you're walking through this space, it's almost like you're walking through a forest, but the pavement is right there. So they really meant to have this sort of clean break with the tree. When they started to re-brick it, they actually expanded that structural frame because they're starting to girdle the trees in 2009. As we looked at them in this project, you can see now it's time to, that structural grates are actually girdling those trees again. When I say girdle, it's strangling them. So these trees will significantly decline if nothing is done with these sort of strangling structural frames. So there, we looked at all the locations. There's over 44% of trees that have great damage from that strangling. So how do you
I'm
replace?
sorry, quick question, was that done in 2009 when, or?
In the re-bricking in 2009, it was redone. Now those trees have grown again.
Right, okay.
Now they're like, oh,
Yeah.
too much, too little. And so this is just, we have details on how you do cut those and expand those in our design package. You can also do road barriers at the same time in these areas, common use out. You can also move the lights that are in conflict with the trees, shifting those to the side. So there are some other updates you can do while you're doing this work. Another approach is to return to the brick, replace just a brick and tree, getting rid of the metal grate, which is actually quite intensive from a cutting standpoint. You have two people to lift it. You have to actually move it away from the tree, or else you'll burn the trunk because of the process of cutting. So this is a way that you can just go back to brick. And there's only a few areas you can do this because you would only do it to an entire grove. You wouldn't do it to one tree, not another tree. So we have just identified there's only 3 areas where you would do just the brick replacement. The other ones would just be a great modification in these areas. We also do the side streets. That's for of how you can update those and with improvements. And then we looked at a few really detailed conditions throughout the mall, such as where there's canopy crowding at the entrance to the mall near the Omni, where you could thin out some of the trees that are competing with each other for the health of the grove. You could also clean up some areas with just some additional mulch so to keep the soil and moisture in the ground, as well as have a better first impression of the downtown mall.
Sorry, just real quick, with the bricking as opposed to the grading, does that have any impact on the health or length of life of the trees?
If you don't do anything to the trees, if you don't cut the grates, then yes. But I think what's nice about the bricking is that the tree will expand and push the foam away, and so it actually can grow into it better. Meanwhile, the grates have to be physically cut; they can't be expanded naturally. Right. So there is a slightly better advantage. But if both are maintained well, they have the same value and impact to the tree.
Thank you. Did you have a question?
Yeah, but I figured it out. Thanks.
There's a lot in here, so thank you. So when we look at, this is another condition of the Freedom of Mall trees. There's a hidden grate in here, and you can start to see this heaving of the bricks around here. There's an accessibility issue. So there's just actually adventitious roots getting under the bricks, over the grate. So there's just a way to actually remove that hidden grate, trim some of those roots. So we have details for improving these areas as well in the report. Also at the end of the Ting Pavilion, there's canopy crowding, conflicts with the pavers as well. Just simple ways of adding mulch to these areas that they can't grow grass anyway. We've talked to the staff at Ting, and they, because there's so much density of people in these areas, they want to be under the shade of the trees, that the grass won't grow anyway. And so mulch actually keeps moisture in the soil, which will enable really healthier trees to hold moisture and nutrients. So that's one approach. There's also a thinning of 2 trees really to help enable the betterment of the grove, as well as 2 new trees we're proposing really to help provide shade on that lawn from the west for concert goers and such, and Fridays after 5. When we look at the historic design intent, this really is focused on the trees, but there are 2 things that were sort of tied together, is the view of how you see the trees, and we'll talk about those, and the fountains just happen to overlay with there, so they kind of overlap in this discussion. But when you think about how you see the trees as the design intent, they are meant to be that you can walk next to them, touch their trunks, experience them. And then you see the cafe zones, which are very different than the design intent, but they are integral to the success of the downtown mall. We're not proposing drastic changes to the cafe zones, but just how you, potentially maybe have some recommendations for what they look like. So things such as potted plants that start to enclose it's privately rented space, but it is publicly designed and intended to be public space. So not blocking or screening views through solid counters or solid fencing, as well as cafe furnishings wrapping around trees and such really shouldn't be allowed. You really want to see the groves and experiencing them as you're walking along, with still enabling cafes to exist, obviously. So we looked at 4 areas. We just happened to focus around the fountains just because of the way the fire lanes work out. But we noticed that there were 7 vendors that took up roughly 30% of all of the cafe areas, and then 3 of those took up over almost 17%. So 3 vendors have a disproportionately large amount of cafe space. And while there's no way to change this unless there's rollover unless there's a policy change from the city, these are just recommendations for how you could do that. And these are, you can start with the top left where you're looking at in front of Bisou and Grit and Christians, where you could just open up that area to see the actual fountain itself, but see the trunks of the trees and walk through those groves. At Central Place, you can just reveal those trees so they're not hidden behind the fountains without really impacting much in the way of cafe areas. Fountain C is looking in front of the Paramount, and how as you're walking in that main corridor, you want to see the trees first in that experience and not see them wrapped in fencing in cafe spaces. So these are just strategies of ways that you could adjust the cafe fencing to reveal the trees, but also to reveal, this is just showing how we sort of just changed that dynamic and getting rid of the extra large trees. But this is for a later study and recommendation for how the cafe fences could be changed or standardized. This is just another bonus, not just seeing the trees, but seeing the fountains. I mean, they really were intended to be public elements for kids to engage with, approach, and to enliven the experience of the mall as you're walking. You hear the sound of the water throughout, so it doesn't have a stagnant feeling as you're walking along the mall. These are really critical design components. And so how do we reveal these? And you can reveal both the trees and the fountains at the same time. These are just simple ways to resolve the accessibility concerns around them, with just grates that would be porous that you could then approach the fountain. You could do this at Central Place as well, having detectable nosing strips at the stairs, so that these are no longer concerns with accessibility. You could remove the chain link and really make these engaging places for people to come to.
Can you explain what this safety nosing is?
It's actually a slight raised, and it actually has a gritty surface to it. So someone who is blind or visually impaired could then know it's coming, as opposed to, there's no railings around it currently or anything else. So how do you make that aware for someone to see it from an accessibility standpoint?
Great, thank you.
We also have a very large report, a conclusive plan for maintenance of the trees, but the majority of the maintenance is not to prune trees. No excessive pruning. These are mature trees. They do not need excessive pruning. So some of the really cabling, structural pruning, these are all in a much larger report and database that's given to Parks and Rec, and how to manage these over time. There's also a larger report, like specific, like take this limb out, don't take that limb out for all these trees. So it's a very comprehensive maintenance plan for these trees. When we think about zoning impacts, the trees are successful right now because they have access to light. The building heights are not very tall. We don't make strong recommendations, but we want you to consider, if you're making zoning changes, of how trees will grow in a canyon effect. They will struggle to grow in full shade. Trees really need that light. So if you have you can see here what is allowable plus bonus. That would be growing in a canyon-like effect. The trees would not grow as long and as healthy and really change the light and the experience of the downtown mall. So as you consider stepping back buildings, that allows a lot more light and keeps a consistent experience for the trees as well as the users of the mall. And you can see, yes.
Can you go back to that last slide for a second?
Yes.
So this is under, that canyon drawing you have on the left would be if every single building on the mall was developed to that height. But the mall is in a protected district with design review, so that wouldn't necessarily happen.
And they could also have step backs, you know, that could be required, but this is the sort of allowable size, so
Right.
if there's a new building going in, this.
Right, so there could be a new building going in, but not every single building is going to be like that. So that-
Unlikely. If there's a large
Right.
block, say, of one big building, like the Code building, had that building been constructed, you know, with a single wall on one edge, that would have changed how the light gets to the tree. So it's really just pointing out the concern with zoning and trees and the mall, and the building heights particularly. But we're not really making strong recommendations for a type of zoning or a, you know, how historical conditions apply.
Because there's also breaks in the block and
Definitely.
all of that, so it wouldn't be one long,
Correct. Yeah. But if you were to give only one tenant, you know, like, okay, you can build a tall building, but you can't build a tall building, or, you know, I don't know how that changes, but anyway. I'll leave that to someone else.
Yeah.
I'm just, step backs are not my favorite thing, so. I'm
I get
just
it.
Pointing out how that's not necessarily going to be the case, the situation on the left.
Okay, well, yeah, great, I hope not. Yeah. This is an example of just how the light does work well and get to those trees, just as a diagram. Long-term recommendations, this is just looking at the tree selection and the phasing. Right now, the willow oak and the red maple were the design trees. Is a yellow fall color, and a red fall color is a strong contrast. If you have only two types of trees, you're, you know, putting them at risk. So when we think about redesigning these trees and think about new species, we want to think about drought tolerance, climate change resilience, disease, pests, tolerance to urban conditions. So this is, and also their form. They want to grow fast. They want to grow tall, consistent with each other, so that you're not going to have a red bud and an oak next to each other. You know, so these have to have a consistent language. And so we ended up with this palette of trees after a sort of long list of you know, American elm, the sort of Jefferson variety, the tulip poplar, swamp white oak, and then the willow oak as well. So. And then the bald cypress has that offset red fall color in the center. So this is that change of the design, but really not trying to change the Halpern vision. And then when we look at the phasing, the long-term phasing, the current tree health is most critical. We want to keep the current trees as healthy and as long as possible. We do not want to take out any trees that we don't recommend taking out. These are, you know, health is number one, a stepped approach is number two, and then the location, obviously, and how it affects. We wouldn't want to take out 3 blocks in a row, for example. So this is just looking at that 4-year phasing over 20 years, and I'll just break these down. We again looked at the health by grove of these trees. Phase 1 we already talked about, really at the center where the trees are already mostly dead or in very poor shape. Phase 2 would then happen, so after that sort of phase 1 was installed, then you start to look at the trees that are least healthy in the next round, then phase 3 and phase 4 of these trees by year 20. So the ideal goal is that phase 1 happens within the next 5 years, it's finished, so that you're starting to budget for it now, getting design drawings and such for it. And you can also see the goal of this is that as phase 1 starts to grow up, you know, when phase 3 is done, we have existing shade in that phase 1 tree, so that you're never having a condition on the mall where you have no shade. You wouldn't take out all the trees at once. So this is really staggering those trees to really develop their shade over time, so that, you know, by the time this is complete, we have really a more complete feeling along the mall. There's a few other just conditions you could do to celebrate, you know, that changing of a block. You could have sort of temporary art installations and such, as you sort of have smaller trees that sort of celebrates that block and that brings life and engagement to that block. And so again, this is a diagram from the beginning that talks about this is what the current condition is of the mall, and we've seen the trees that are being lost, and we know that there is a projection of these trees to continue to decline, and so if nothing is done. So this is hopefully that future of the downtown mall and looking at those trees. And with that, questions? Thank you very much.
It's a really impressive report.
Yeah, it's really.
Very interesting.
Yeah.
Thank you.
So I'm gonna start with Michael. Do you have any comments or questions?
Yeah, I would say, as others already said, you know, I appreciate the level of detail in the report. I think, it's easy to kind of take for granted the downtown mall as a historic resource. And certainly in terms of the amount of people who visit it, it's our most engaged with historical resource. And I think it is a historic resource in terms of not just the history and architectural design, but the experience walking at Tree Canopy, the architecture, and it was created with a lot of intentionality, and I think it will only be preserved and maintained with a lot of intentionality. I would say in terms of some of the things you raised, some of my just thoughts where it would seem to me, doing, even if the cost is higher, doing what we need to have new trees have the longest lifespan possible. Obviously, at least to me, seems like the more sensible path, as well as it seems like bricking them, if that doesn't have an impact on the health of the trees, seems like a good approach to go. I also strongly agree in terms of changing how people engage with the fountains. I don't know what the best approach ultimately may be, but currently it just seems clearly not optimal. And I think it almost looks like they're under construction or just like should not be approached in any way, and kind of has the feel of hostile architecture. And I hope we can figure out how to not have that be the permanent way the fountains are engaged with. And yeah, I feel like the trees in a lot of ways are critical to the success of the downtown mall, because people probably wouldn't want to be there as long, especially on a hot day, without the shade. So I was interested, when it's phased in, obviously maximizing with the phasing the amount of shade that's available, but also, will there be critical time periods or areas you identified where having, at least on a temporary basis, shade that is not coming from the trees when they're starting to grow, kind of what that timing would be or what that may look like? Would that be to come at like a later point, or?
You could have art installations that sort of offer like a little bit of shade. You're never going to get the cooling of a tree. It releases water vapor and all these things are really cool the temperature down, but you could have some light shade in installations. The proposed trees are larger caliper trees that would go in and ideally provide some shade right away. We wouldn't put in small 2-inch caliper trees. Ideally within 5 years, you really have a shade that's returned to these areas.
Right. And the other thing it made me wonder about is, with the Board of Architectural Review, whether, well, I think we all know, revising their guidelines will be important, but particularly in the context of the downtown mall with, there's now a greater allowed height by right, which is obviously in many ways a positive thing in terms of fulfilling the vision of a mixed-use site where people can also live. But that also, comes with a lot of very specific considerations, and I don't know, I just genuinely don't know if the BAR, is in a place where they feel like they can engage with specificity on these new questions. And I think there's an opportunity maybe to clarify it and strengthen it, because I think this is a historic resource with a lot of competing historic resource, public space, also commercial and residential district. I think preserving it will require a lot of specificity and detail, and I just hope the BAR can engage with that. And I don't think that has to come at the cost of allowing people to live there. But I think it will only be preserved with a lot of intentionality, and I wonder if the BAR is in a place where they feel they have all the tools necessary to do that. So that's just a question it raised to me, which I guess is outside your purview. And then the last thing, every time we see a presentation on it, I always wonder about, the downtown mall kind of being an unfinished vision. We've got that large surface parking lot right next to it. What would expanding it in a very creative, big picture way look there? But anyway, I really appreciate the report and the detail.
Okay. Natalie?
Yeah, I like a lot of what Michael just said, especially about the expanding the mall part. What makes it successful is, having people be there and having it be an enjoyable place for people. And then what's great about, the trees, like you said, it's different than a structure providing shade, as there's the evaporative cooling and the water moisture and all of that, and, the pleasant sound of leaves rustling and like all the things that make us enjoy nature. One of the things that I want to consider on a larger scale beyond just, expanding the mall, I think that's a good conversation for us to have at some point, is something that we've brought up here and there, but not in a dedicated way, which is removing the car crossings which then is a lot of space that's in full sun, that the trade-off is not between trees and somewhere for people to live, but trees and cars. And that to me is a much, much easier choice to make, because, you know, every person that lives downtown is a person who doesn't buy a house from a clear-cut development in the county, saving those trees. So that's the kind of the broader scale that I'm thinking of when we look at this. So that's where I would want to find both more space for trees, but also more space for cafes and cafe seating, and expand those, which, again, the more people that are downtown, the more seats you're going to need to have for them to, you know, eat and drink and hang out and have that third space. With that kind of a question that I had about, you mentioned the vendors and the cafe space that they have. It kind of felt like you were implying there was an issue with a smaller number of vendors having more space versus the others. Is that
Not an issue, an observation.
okay? I wasn't sure if
Yeah.
there was.
Nope. I mean,
some-
it happens to be that the larger, you know, the ones that have the most amount of room often are concealing the center of the grove and the actual experience of the fountains. So they happen to just, you know, be at that juncture there. So no real,
Yeah.
we're not, I don't know if there's an ability to change the current, you know, if a tenant turns over, maybe there's that ability, or if there's a change in the design. So it's really just a recommendation that there be another study for the fencing of the cafe areas, so.
Okay, and I definitely can appreciate the fact that it is a public space and public access to the trees and the fountains is good. The exact barriers for folks to use in the cafes is not a hill that I'm really gonna fight too hard on. But I did really like the look of the brick to the trunk versus the grate, and that just.
It's incredible.
It's great.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's just an immediate accessibility that is really lovely and both stylish and comfortable.
It's really thoughtful when they planned it, you know, where you'd be able to kind of walk up to the trees like you're in nature. I didn't realize all that. So.
Yeah, that's nice. And then I am going to bring up a question I had earlier, which is the suggestion for doing the block replacement with the suspended slab. So that's not what's currently there. It's just slab on top of dirt.
Correct.
Okay.
Yeah, and willow oaks are very tolerant of tough urban conditions, and they were able, like, we have really good soils here that have some ability to hold sort of that pore space in the soil, so they've done really well.
Yeah, I'm
considering.
surprised it's not more wonky.
Well, there is a thick 8 to 10 inch concrete slab underneath all the bricks, so none of those, you know, we wouldn't
They're
get
not
any
gonna make
heaving
it.
of that.
Okay.
So we would replicate that. It's just the soils beneath are really compacted.
Cool. And then it was also just a point, again, not outside of your scope, but nice to see in some of the pictures you were showing, the way I remember the mall as a kid with seating and, you know, running up to the fountains and trying to prevent our dogs from drinking out of them, and, like, you know, having that accessibility, nice, but especially the seating. So hopefully we can talk more about bringing that back as well.
Yeah, and sorry, just real quick, that made me think. In your analysis, did the cafe seating seem to crowd out public seating? Because one of the conversations is obviously providing more public seating, which I think would be positive and help fulfill the original vision. Was the cafe seating a barrier to that, or is it really just that we haven't
I mean, you look at where the original public seating was, it was around fountains, and it was, you know, places that parents could sit and watch their kids play and feel comfortable watching their kids, you know, that is now barricaded in the middle of the cafe zones. And then the other areas are the fire lanes. I mean, it's pretty much all dictated by fire lane and the cafe space, and so.
Second, repedestrianizing, you know,
Yeah,
side streets to
reclaiming
the
that
extent
space gives us a
possible.
lot more flexibility for the people that use it.
Yeah, and side streets have a lot of opportunity to be designed as destinations and not cut-through spaces, you know, as well.
Yeah, or places to put your car for just a minute. Yeah. Thanks.
Brian?
No, I just that it's a very interesting report, and I'm assuming that, Mr. Sanders, we're tracking this in terms of future investments for the CIP?
for future discussions about you
Okay.
putting it in CIP,
All right.
yes, maybe.
That's a very good answer.
That's all I have.
Yeah, Lloyd?
So I'm curious about the graph or the chart that you show about the effect of height on shade on the mall. And I'm wondering in particular if there is a tree, or are there trees that grow particularly well in the kind of shade that might be provided if we had some tall building that was basically making it impossible for direct sunlight to hit that area?
There are certainly trees that grow better than others in full shade. Willow oaks are not one of those trees, so that would not be recommended in a full shade scenario. But there are some other trees that, I don't know if it's any of the trees we've suggested, but it limits it. It just, those trees will have less resources. They will grow differently than the current trees do. It's just that the canopy will be higher, it'll be thinner.
If we had a building that was going up that was going to now block the sun from, let's say, some willow oaks that were currently doing just fine, how long are we likely to have before those trees begin to seriously deteriorate?
I don't think I could give you a number exactly of how long it would take. But
Is it a year or two or 5 or 10?
Oh, it'd be 5 or 10. I mean, trees just slowly, they'll just keep working, and you'll start to see limb drop, and you'll start to see thinning. And if you do see major construction impact to a tree, it's not day one. It's always like, okay, now we lost another branch, another branch, another branch, and then you have second Garrett or something.
Okay. That's all, thank you.
So, there was, a lot of my questions and comments have been answered by others, but I did want to kind of dive a little bit deeper in what Natalie was talking about, the cafe space on the mall, and maybe that's something for James or Sam, is that how often are they updated? Because I think that, I know they might keep it for, I don't know how long those contracts or leases are for, but as they come up, if, once this is done and we look at how that can be, it would be good to reclaim some of that space back for the public,
Yeah, so the policy as it stands today, the cafe spaces are smaller than they were when they were originally created, but you can't create a smaller cafe space until you have a turnover in ownership. So our leases are annual leases, but the way the system is set up is somebody has a larger cafe space until there's a turnover in the ownership of that leaseholder. We can't shrink shrink the size of the cafe space. Now, that's all a matter of policy, so that's something that could be brought before council to discuss and make changes to.
And I'd like to say for the record, I'm not out here saying we should shrink cafe spaces. They're, vital for the success of the businesses downtown, but a rearrangement is not out of the question with where they're located, especially if we reclaim space that's currently intersections used by cars crossing the mall.
So past decisions have been made to shrink what is the allowed sizes, but the larger ones stay in place until there's a turnover in ownership. Right? So that's why the handful that were pointed out as being larger than the average are ones where we've had long-term stable ownership, if you will.
If the ownership changes, is there an automatic downsizing, or does
Yeah.
it come in? Okay.
Yeah, as the policy is currently written, yeah. So we've recently had, one of the larger ones has had a change in ownership, and they're going to be shrinking. But as it's currently set up, what happens is there's a shrinking, and now you have 2 cafe spaces where there was once 1. And what we need to, one of the things we'd need to change if we were looking to do something along those lines is not have that automatically split into 2, but instead just shrink down to 1. So an effort needs to be made to revisit these policies if there's an interest in pursuing some of the ideas presented here tonight, to change the policies, both perhaps in terms of how a change in size happens or overall a change in layout.
Yeah, and I think what I had in mind is not necessarily maybe change in configuration, because maybe they can have the same size, but it's different configuration so that the public can get closer to the fountains and the trees and things like that. So that's kind of what I had in mind. So I would like at some point to see that as we are doing a park master plan, looking at these trees and talking about what the original intent of the downtown mall was for. And I think we can do it all, and it's fun how all these things come in together, because it would have been good to have some of this before we had done the zoning rewrite. We still may have voted the same thing for the size of but at least we would have had the information, so.
One of the things sorry.
I think we might be saying the same thing. Go ahead.
I probably not. But the cafe seating with heaters, was that the same time?
Oh, that was one of my bullet points.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Is obviously the heaters damaged the trees, and we've seen that. As I understand it, heaters aren't allowed, but maybe I'm wrong in that. But they certainly seem to be utilized in the winter months, even if they aren't allowed. And kind of what does regulation and enforcement practically look like?
I think there's a distance.
But
They are
like, how
allowed
does that
to change to a
enforced?
distance. Now it has to be 10 feet away from the trees. After our last presentation, there was a policy written that they have to stay 10 foot away from the trees. And how is it enforced? I'll leave that to Strange.
Because that's
So we do
tricky.
That's very tricky because we do not have enforcement happening. So we actually put our trust in the owner. And if our urban forester or if our crew sees something, we then communicate to NDS to inform the owner about, just to make sure that you are very close to the tree, please move your heater away.
Let me know, just to one correction, it's not that we don't have enforcement. Right, today NDS is doing the enforcement. So we have staff that occasionally walk up and down the mall and look for these issues as well as sign issues and various other things. There's a whole body of rules that govern the use of the cafe spaces that we enforce. And we sent a reminder letter out some time ago telling everybody about the new policy for the heaters. But we also work closely with parks. Many people on the parks side will let our person know that there's an issue, and then we go out and we deal with it.
So I'll add that it's interesting that the job description for this job doesn't have weaving it all together, because that tends to be what I spend a great deal of my time trying to figure out. The Downtown Mall Committee heard a lot of this and other things. There are many, many things that James and I have talked about needing to figure out how to prioritize. As he referenced policy, there are certain things that we're going to need to bring back to council for you all to weigh in on, make some decisions on. It will be using some of your capital because not everything is going to be viewed as positive and non-controversial. We understand that as well. But part of the challenges for us is we're doing certain things. We're not doing all the things all the time in our best way. Process matters. And that is one of my favorite words, as you all know. So we're looking at trying to weave these different things together. And it's just interesting how some of the issues that we are spending time on, they all kind of interconnect. I mean, Rion he's leading the team that maintains the mall on a daily basis, while James's team has to do some enforcement here and there. There is no centralized party that would simply be a governor of the mall, and when they see something out of compliance could actually speak to it right then and there and or report it. That speaks to part of the challenge that I see, and we have not historically brought forth the best singular process to kind of weed out the problems, and that's what we're getting to. So I think you're going to see more of that as we work through this. But we thank our team here for helping us understand about the trees, because I heard a lot about the trees, and that they're vulnerable and needing special attention. And each day that goes by in their current state, we're probably only making it worse with the heaters and the various things that we're doing with what conditions have been allowed to persist until now. So we've got to start doing some things, and that's going to cost money. So we've got to help balance all of that for you as well.
The point that I wanted to reemphasize too was by claiming the side streets as more mall space, that is also more space that the cafes could go to, that gets the central mall a little more flexibility to have, public seating and public space. And like we had that commenter recently come and say, like, there's nowhere for her to sit to take a break. and so, she has to go home, or, water fountains or public bathrooms in the
Right.
side streets, like, all of those could be in play by snagging some space away from the asphalt.
Okay. Other questions or comments? This is really good information. I got a lot of tidbits down. I'm going to use it as I'm talking to individuals about the city. So thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you so much.
Yeah.
All right.
All right, we have a motion for a city council closed session pursuant to section 2.2-3712 of the Virginia Code. I move that this city council close this open meeting and convene in a closed session as authorized by the Virginia Freedom of Information Act as follows. 1, under Virginia Code section 2.2-3711A1 for discussion and consideration of assignment, appointment, performance, demotion, salary, discipline, and/or resignation of a specific named employee of the public body.
Second.
Okay, can we vote? We're now in closed session. We'll return at 6:30. And for those that's joining by Zoom, there'll be a separate link for that 6:30 meeting. Thank you.